Story 1. The everyday life of a Byzantine candle maker. Imagine yourself walking the narrow, uneven streets of Constantinople sometime in the 10th century. The city bustles with merchants shouting prices, donkeys clattering hooves against stone, and the endless murmur of prayers wafting from churches and chapels. Among the countless trades that sustained this imperial capital, one of the quieter, less celebrated occupations was that of the candle maker. In Greek, he might be known as a kyriaplathos, a worker in wax. His shop would not sit at the glamorous crossroads of the great markets, but rather in a modest side street, its air heavy with the mingled scents of tallow, beeswax, and faint smoke. The Byzantine Empire relied on light not just for practical survival, but for spiritual practice. Candles were offered before icons, carried in processions, and lit in monasteries at all hours. The demand was constant, steady, and deeply tied to the rhythms of faith. For the ordinary candle maker, this created a curious mixture of stability and monotony in his work. The process of making candles was deceptively simple, yet each stage carried its own quiet discipline. Most candles were made from either tallow, the rendered fat of sheep or cattle, or beeswax, the more prized and costly alternative. Tallow was cheap and widely available, but it smoked, sputtered, and left behind an acrid odor. Beeswax, by contrast, burned with a clean, steady flame and carried the faint sweetness of flowers. This distinction alone reflected the hierarchies of Byzantine life. Wealthy merchants and church officials could afford beeswax, while the poorer citizens accepted the imperfections of tallow. Our candle maker's day often began before sunrise. He would gather at his workshop, a small, dimly lit space with rough stone floors. Hanging from the rafters were rows of drying wicks, spun from linen or hemp, cut to size and prepared for dipping. Large iron or bronze cauldrons sat over low fires, where chunks of tallow or yellowish beeswax would be slowly melted down. The heat filled the room, not intense like a blacksmith's forge, but heavy and persistent, clinging to the skin. The dipping of wicks was an exercise in patience. Each wick was lowered carefully into the molten fat or wax, lifted out, and hung to cool. This process was repeated again and again, sometimes dozens of times, as the candle grew layer by layer. The rhythm of dipping became almost meditative, broken only by the occasional hiss of hot wax meeting a drop of moisture. A skilled candle maker could judge the thickness of a candle simply by eye, knowing when it had reached the size demanded by a customer or an order from a local church. Yet the candle maker's life was not solitary. Apprentices often worked under him, boys as young as 12, whose tasks included cutting wicks, tending the fires, and carrying heavy buckets of water. These apprentices learned through observation and repetition, gradually becoming trusted enough to dip or mold candles themselves. Their chatter filled the workshop, mingling with the crackle of firewood and the faint sound of traders outside. The trade also had its hazards. Molten tallow could scald, fires could spread, and smoke could choke in the poorly ventilated spaces. The work left its mark, hands perpetually slick with grease, clothes infused with a lingering smell, and lungs heavy from years of inhaling smoke. It was not glorious work, but it was steady, and steady meant survival. One cannot consider the Byzantine candle maker without recognizing the deep intertwining of his craft with the church. Every cathedral, every chapel, every roadside shrine demanded candles. Religious processions through the streets of Constantinople glowed with flickering beeswax lights, while the great Hagia Sophia devoured thousands upon thousands of candles each year. Records suggest that certain monasteries and churches held contracts with local candle makers, ensuring a continuous supply. For our craftsmen, such arrangements were lifelines, providing not wealth, but the security of regular income. Payment, too, came in different forms. A wealthy patron might pay in coin, but smaller transactions were often conducted in barter. A farmer might trade eggs, a baker bread, or a fisherman salted herring in exchange for a bundle of tallow candles. This barter economy kept the candle maker connected to the broader web of urban life, his humble product slipping quietly into homes, workshops, and shrines across the city. Beyond the workshop, the candle maker's world extended to the guild. Byzantine trades were often organized into associations, which regulated prices, ensured fair competition, and provided mutual support. Membership in a guild offered protection but also imposed obligations. Candle makers, like bakers or butchers, were watched carefully by officials, who ensured that no one cheated the public with poor-quality goods. A candle that burned unevenly or sputtered excessively could bring complaints, and complaints could bring fines. Still, despite these networks of control, the candle maker lived a life largely invisible to history. He did not leave behind great works of art, nor the chronicles of kings. His existence was preserved instead in fragments, mentions in legal codes, stray notes in church accounts, and the physical evidence of candles themselves, unearthed in monasteries or described in liturgical texts. It is in these fragments that we can begin to reconstruct the quiet rhythm of his days. As the sun dipped below the walls of Constantinople, our candle maker's work often continued. Orders had to be completed, molds had to be cleaned, and apprentices had to be guided. The faint golden light of beeswax candles illuminated the very hands that had made them, a circular irony not lost on the craftsman. He lit his own dwelling with the product of his labor, though likely the cheaper tallow variety, saving the finer beeswax for those who could pay. In this balance of survival and service, of dull repetition and quiet devotion, the Byzantine candle maker's life unfolded. His hands shaped the light that filled the empire's sacred spaces, yet his name, like the smoke of tallow, vanished into the air. And so we are left to wonder. In a city where emperors built marble palaces and priests chanted in echoing cathedrals, what did it mean that the humble glow of a candle, made by an unseen hand, sustained both prayer and empire alike? As the empire rose and waned, wax endured. The candle maker's place in Byzantine society may have been modest, but his product was anything but trivial. In Byzantium, light was more than illumination, it was sacred symbolism, ritual necessity, and imperial metaphor. And the deeper you step into the candle maker's world, the clearer it becomes. Wax was power, both divine and earthly, melted and reshaped by human hands. After years of slow, careful apprenticeship, a candle maker might establish his own workshop, not a grand space, but a serviceable one. Its tools were few but essential: kettles of hammered copper or blackened iron for melting, long rods for suspending wicks, and a set of molds, typically carved from wood or fashioned from bronze. Wax was poured and cooled, a delicate process requiring precise temperature control. Too hot, and it warped the mold. Too cool, and it would crack or become pocked with air. By the 10th century, Constantinople's candle makers were expected to master both dipping and molding techniques. Molding was preferred for more ornate or symmetrical candles, the kind offered in churches on feast days or presented at baptisms and weddings. Some even bore intricate designs pressed into their sides: crosses, saints, or monograms of the Theotokos. These patterns were not merely decorative but devotional. They turned ordinary light into an offering. Where did all this wax come from? Beeswax, the premium material of the trade, was harvested across the empire. Beekeeping was common in rural villages, monastic estates, and even some urban back gardens. Hives were made of woven straw, clay pots, or hollowed logs, carefully tended by those who understood the seasonal rhythms of bees. Wax was harvested after the honey boiled and filtered, often through linen cloths, to remove impurities. Candle makers rarely processed their own. They bought it by the block from traders who brought it into the capital by cart, riverboat, or caravan. Some of this wax came from as far away as the forests of the Balkans or the fields of Anatolia. In times of shortage, prices could double, affecting not only candle makers but entire churches that depended on wax for liturgical use. There were even state records of emperors requisitioning wax for major festivals, drawing from both public and private stocks. In this way, The humble candle was sometimes caught up in the machinery of imperial logistics, no small matter, when one considers that great public services like Easter or imperial coronations required thousands of candles. Tallow, in contrast, was a more local affair. Derived from livestock fat, it was plentiful but unpleasant. It yellowed over time, emitted a cloying odor, and attracted insects. Still, it was a staple among the working classes. Most urban workshops would process their own tallow in dedicated cauldrons, separated from the beeswax to prevent cross-contamination. The rendering of tallow was a repellent task. The boiling of fat sent clouds of oily smoke into the narrow streets, and neighbors often complained. Yet the economics of light made this unpleasantness necessary. In the candle maker's ledger, often just a wax tablet or a parchment scrap tucked into a niche, one could see the hierarchy of flame. Beeswax for the church, tallow for the household. Beeswax for bishops, tallow for bakers. Most intriguing, perhaps, is how central candles became to both public and private ritual. At the heart of Orthodox devotion stood the icon, and before the icon always a flame. Every home, no matter how humble, was expected to maintain a small devotional corner and iconostasis, with images of saints and Christ, adorned with small candle holders. Lighting a candle was a form of prayer, a wordless plea or gesture of gratitude. So when a mother came to the candle maker's shop and requested 10 small tallow candles, 5 to honor St. Nicholas and 5 for the health of her child, it was not a mere transaction. It was spiritual maintenance. When a young man bought a beeswax taper to present at his baptism or wedding, it was both gift and rite. And the candle maker, in his quiet way, facilitated all these acts. Over time, the candle maker developed a keen understanding of religious calendars. The feast days of saints, the arrival of Lent, the Easter vigil, these dictated the rhythms of production. The days before Pascha, Easter, were particularly intense, with orders surging to meet the needs of both churches and households. In those weeks, sleep was rare. Apprentices worked by candlelight to prepare more candles. Fires never went out. The smell of wax clung to everything: beds, hair, even dreams. In the midst of this intensity, the candle maker might find himself called upon to provide something very specific: the examologitarian candle, a long taper used during acts of public penance, or the thick, double-wicked candles carried by acolytes during the divine liturgy. Some monks preferred unbleached wax, believing it more humble. Others wanted theirs pure and pale. Custom orders abounded, and a good candle maker kept meticulous notes, if not for posterity, then at least to remember that Abbot Theophanes of the Petrian monastery preferred 7-inch molded beeswax with an olive oil finish. And then there were funerals. Byzantines understood death as both rupture and passage. Candles were burned continuously around the deceased's body, both as a vigil and as a light for the departing soul. A family might order a dozen candles, or sometimes more, to be placed near the bier, carried in procession to the church, and then to the tomb. The candle maker's work, made in silence, often accompanied people at their most tender moments of grief. He likely never attended the funerals, but his candles did. Despite this quiet role, the candle maker was not invisible in his community. Neighbors knew him, priests nodded in greeting, and children, always fascinated by the glowing workshop, lingered near his door. He may have offered extra candles to the poor, or gifted a bundle to a nearby widow for feast day prayers. Such small acts earned him a reputation not just as a tradesman, but as a quietly pious man. Even within the bustling, layered world of Constantinople, candle makers had their small rituals. Some whispered a prayer before lighting the fire for the day's wax. Others crossed themselves when pouring wax into a mold, a habit born of repetition or faith or both. And in a world so often shaken by politics, sieges, and theological disputes, these small gestures anchored them. But change, as ever, was constant. As the empire aged, imported wax became more expensive. State control over guilds tightened. Some workshops began to consolidate. Larger producers emerged who could fulfill bulk orders more efficiently. Rumors spread of synthetic mixtures, waxes cut with resins or animal fats to stretch supplies. The quality suffered. Traditionalists resisted. The candle maker, now older, grumbled at the changes. He stayed loyal to the old formulas, even as others shifted toward profit. And yet, demand never ceased. So long as there were prayers to be offered, saints to be honored, and darkness to be driven back, candles would be needed. Even in political chaos during the riots of the 11th century, during patriarchal disputes or civil wars, the light burned on. Sometimes the candle maker stood in Hagia Sophia during a great vigil, anonymous among the crowd, and saw hundreds of his own creations flickering in the half-light. He might have smiled, faintly, knowing that though his name would never be carved into marble, his work illuminated it. He was not a priest, nor a scholar, nor a soldier, but he was a craftsman, and his labor helped people see. And as he returned home that evening, oil lamp in hand, the city dark and silent around him, he may have wondered, would this simple craft survive another generation? Would his apprentice, now a young man, carry on the old techniques? Or would the wax change, the rituals shift, the city itself evolve beyond memory? The years passed with the silent pace of wax cooling in a mold. Our candle maker, once a vigorous apprentice himself, now worked with slower hands. The repetition of decades had worn his joints, stiffened his back, and thinned his breath. Still, each morning the fire was lit, the kettles were filled, and the dipping rods prepared. He moved with purpose, not speed, and the shop held a quiet reverence that came only with age. This was no longer the Constantinople of his youth. The empire had shifted again, borders redrawn, alliances tested. Emperors had risen and fallen. The population swelled with refugees from the east, from the Bulgarian frontier, from lands lost to the Arabs. And yet, the candles kept burning. By now, the candle maker had trained many apprentices. Some left to open their own shops in other quarters of the city. One had joined a monastery, continuing the craft for purely liturgical purposes. Another disappeared during a plague outbreak, a reminder of the fragility that hung over every Byzantine citizen. Only one remained, a quiet, observant young man named Marcos. He had joined the workshop as a boy of 11, shy and thin, his hands too small to lift the kettles. Now nearly 20, he worked with fluid skill. He could judge the weight of a beeswax taper by holding it in one hand, and could diagnose a flaw in a mold just by the way a finished candle cooled. The old man saw in Marcos not just a student, but an heir. And with that realization came the responsibility of passing on more than just technique. He began telling stories, not grand tales of emperors, but small, precise lessons. This, he would say, holding up a roll of linen wick, is from the women at the monastery in Blascherny. Their thread burns slower. Always use it for vigil candles. Or do not trust wax from the pier merchants in May. It comes spoiled from the spring rains. Or, when a man asks for 5 candles but looks like he can only afford 2, ask him who they're for. If he says his mother's grave, give him 6. There were no books in the workshop, no ledgers worth preserving. Everything the candle maker knew lived in gestures, smells, and these quiet murmurs to his apprentice. Knowledge passed, not declared. Outside the shop, the city continued to evolve. The 11th century brought with it increased imperial instability and theological tensions. Though candle makers rarely made their way into these debates, they felt their tremors. One year, the Church of St. George in the Forum no longer needed candles. The patron had died, his estate left unresolved. Another year, a procession was canceled due to military unrest, leaving the workshop overstocked. Even so, faith persisted. The people lit candles not just in cathedrals but in secret. During times of uncertainty, the flame became a kind of defiance. A widow lighting a taper before an icon of the Theotokos was making more than an offering. She was asserting continuity, connection, hope. And the candle maker, even in his solitude, was part of that hope. In his final years, he stopped attending church regularly, not out of impiety but because walking became difficult. Still, he would send his apprentice with a bundle of fresh beeswax tapers each Sunday, for the narthex and for the icon of St. John, he insisted. Marcos always complied. Sometimes, old clients would visit the workshop simply to talk. A priest from the Church of the Holy Apostles, a merchant's wife who had once ordered 30 molded candles for her daughter's wedding, a former apprentice, now thick with gray, bringing bread and cheese. They all shared in the quiet understanding that the candle maker was nearing his end. But it wasn't illness or violence that took him. One morning, Marcos arrived at the workshop to find the fire unlit, the wax cold, and the door unlocked. Inside, on the old wooden stool near the molds, the candle maker sat motionless, eyes closed, a small, half-dipped taper still clutched in his hand. He had simply stopped. Marcos wept not loudly, not theatrically, but with the slow, aching grief that only comes from losing the one person who gave shape to your world. He prepared the body as he had seen done before. He lit 6 beeswax candles, not tallow, not mixed, and placed them around the old man's bed. A neighbor priest came to chant the psalms. Some who had known the candle maker gathered to pray, to murmur stories, to give thanks. There was no grand ceremony, only wax and flame and memory. The workshop did not close. Marcos continued the work slowly at first, his grief tangled in the rhythm of the trade. But over time, his movements became steadier. He made small changes, improved the ventilation, invested in better molds, learned to blend small amounts of resin for improved burn time. He trained 2 apprentices of his own, both of them orphans, one from Thrace, the other from a nearby poorhouse. The wax continued to arrive from distant fields, the tallow from nearby butchers. Candles were still ordered for feast days, funerals, births. The rituals endured. And as the years passed, a strange thing happened. The name of the old candle maker, never recorded in state archives, never etched in marble, faded. But the candles he had made, the practices he had preserved, the knowledge he had passed on, those endured. A century later, a scholar copying legal records might stumble upon a notation. The wax for St. Mama's feast, ordered from the workshop of Marcos, formerly of the elder unnamed but remembered. That, perhaps, is the quiet immortality of such lives. In the great sweep of Byzantine history and the councils, the schisms, the wars, the emperors crowned and exiled, the candle maker was invisible. But without him, the churches would have dimmed. The prayers would have lacked their glowing companion. The sacred would have lost its shimmer. Even now, centuries later, fragments of his world remain. Candles found in tombs and chapels, references in the typica of monasteries, traces of beeswax residue clinging to old bronze candlesticks in museums. You can still smell it faintly if you close your eyes, a warm, honeyed scent soaked into stone and wood. And so in the quiet folds of time, we remember him, not by name but by light. Because somewhere, long after he is gone, someone still whispers a prayer before lighting a taper. Somewhere, in a dark chapel, a single flame flickers in silence. And it began, perhaps, in the worn, wax-stained hands of a man, whose story almost vanished but didn't. Reflection. The candle maker's story reminds us that history isn't always made by generals or emperors. Sometimes, it is shaped by the hands that craft the humble tools of faith and survival. The mundane act of dipping wax becomes, in repetition, a quiet resistance to chaos. And in a world where names fade and monuments fall, perhaps it is the soft, flickering light of an ordinary life, unnoticed, yet essential, that truly endures. Story 2. Grain ships of Rome, feeding an empire. It is early morning in the port of Ostia, sometime in the 2nd century CE. The salty breeze rolls in from the Tyrrhenian Sea, tugging at togas and stirring up the ever-present haze of grain dust. The docks are already busy, even before the sun clears the horizon. Cranes creak, sailors shout, stevedores grunt under the weight of sacks and amphorae, and everywhere there is grain packed in baskets, poured into warehouses, and loaded onto barges bound for the heart of Rome. To keep the city fed, the Roman Empire built one of the most complex logistical systems the ancient world had ever seen. At its center were the grain ships, sturdy, wide-bellied vessels that carried tons of wheat across the Mediterranean. They weren't glamorous. They didn't sail into battle or carry marble statues, but without them, the empire's capital would starve. Rome was unique in its hunger. By the 1st century CE, it was the largest city in the Western world, home to more than 1 million people. These people did not grow their own food. They depended almost entirely on imported grain, primarily from Egypt and North Africa. Each year, some 150,000 tons of grain were shipped to the capital. That grain became panem, the bread that fed both citizens and politics. The story of a grain ship is not a dramatic one. There are no pirate battles here, no great sea chases. But it is a story of quiet endurance, of sea winds and salt caked onto ropes, of forms filled out in triplicate by scribes who never left their port offices. It is a story of infrastructure, of tides and timetables, and of the ordinary sailors and workers who kept the capital from going hungry. Let us start, not with the emperor or his governors, but with a man named Lucius, the overseer of a small grain ship tied up at Ostia. Lucius was not a captain in the romantic sense. He was a logistics man, a navicularius responsible for loading, transporting, and delivering grain. He owned the vessel, managed the crew, and dealt with imperial agents. His ship, the Minerva Felix, was a mid-sized freighter, capable of carrying about 80 tons of wheat. It was squat and broad, with a square sail, twin steering oars, and a hull built more for stability than speed. Every voyage began not with sailing, but with paperwork. Before departure, Lucius had to register his ship with the annona, the imperial grain distribution system. The annona was more than just a bureaucratic machine, it was a lifeline. Overseen by officials known as praefecti annoni, it controlled the flow of grain from the provinces to Rome. Lucius had to declare the tonnage, origin, destination, and planned departure date. If approved, he received a wax-sealed certificate authorizing the shipment. Then came the contracts, the locatio conductio. Some voyages were funded by the state, others were private ventures contracted by wealthy grain merchants. Either way, every ship had to keep detailed manifests listing the origin of the grain, the name of the supplier, and the intended recipient in Rome. Grain fraud was not uncommon, and the penalties could be severe: seizure of cargo, fines, even forced labor for repeat offenders. Once the paperwork was in order, the cargo was loaded. The grain was packed in sacks made of woven flax or animal skin, tied with rope, and stacked tightly in the hold. Great care was taken to keep the load balanced. A tilted ship could capsize in bad weather. Rats were an ever-present threat, and so every cargo hold was lined with ash or sand, and sometimes even patrolled by cats, or more often ferrets. Lucius made sure the loading was supervised by an experienced foreman. One loose sack, and the cargo could shift disastrously. Then at last came the wait for the right wind. Grain ships were at the mercy of nature. The sailing season ran from spring to early fall, from March to November, but most shipments clustered in the late summer, just after harvest. Ships could take anywhere from 2 weeks to several months to reach Italy from Alexandria, depending on wind and weather. Even from Carthage or Leptis Magna, the voyage could be treacherous. Sudden storms could wreck a vessel near Sicily or drive it ashore on the Dalmatian coast. Once under sail, the routine was dull, harsh, and repetitive. Sailors were not citizens. Most were freedmen or slaves working long hours in cramped quarters. The food was coarse: salted fish, lentils, dried bread. Water was stored in amphorae, quickly turning stale. The smell of grain dust mixed with sweat and tar, a constant, choking aroma. Lucius did not travel on every voyage, but when he did, he slept near the helm, wrapped in a wool cloak. Navigation was done by landmarks, stars, and experience. There were no maps in the modern sense. A good helmsman could recognize the profile of Crete at 20 miles. A bad one could run aground in Sardinia's shallow bays. The return voyage, if successful, ended not in Rome proper, but at Ostia, the main port, 15 miles down the Tiber. There, port inspectors from the Cura Annani met the ship. They checked seals, confirmed manifests, and recorded the weight of the grain. Losses were expected: sacks tore, rats fed, waves soaked the hold, but if too much grain was missing, an investigation followed. Once cleared, the grain was transferred to river barges or stored in Horia state granaries. From there, it was distributed to bakeries, military stockpiles, or sent upriver into Rome. Some of it was baked into loaves and handed out for free to eligible citizens under the grain dole, or fermentatio, a system that had existed since the time of the Gracchi brothers in the late Republic. For Rome's poor, this free grain was essential. A loaf of bread could be the difference between survival and starvation. Each eligible citizen received a monthly allowance, tracked by wooden or bronze tokens stamped with imperial markings. These were exchanged for sacks of grain at designated stations. The process was orderly, tightly managed, and constantly under threat from shortages. Sometimes, bad harvests in Egypt or delays at sea led to bread riots. One such incident, recorded in the Historia Augusta, describes how a late shipment led to days of panic, market inflation, and public unrest. The emperor had to intervene, promising grain from his private estates to calm the crowds. Lucius, of course, heard about this through rumors on the docks. He knew better than most how fragile the system was, how one missed wind, one sunken ship, could cascade into crisis. And yet the system endured. The empire's stability, its roads, its cities, its armies depended on a loaf of bread, and that bread depended on ships like Minerva Felix, and on men like Lucius who filled out forms, balanced sacks, and cursed the headwinds. But even Lucius could not see all ends. The grain system would begin to falter in the coming centuries. As the empire strained under invasions, corruption, and decentralization, the annona grew less efficient. Ships went unpaid, warehouses stood half empty, doles were interrupted, and eventually the city of Rome, once fed like a god, shrank, starved, and faded into history. But in Lucius' time the ships still sailed, the grain still flowed, and the empire, at least from the docks of Ostia, seemed eternal. Still, one question lingered as Lucius watched a fresh shipment depart toward the horizon. What would happen if, one day, the ships didn't come? If the grain ships were Rome's lifeline, Egypt was its beating heart. By the time of the Roman Empire, the fertile Nile Valley had become the single most important agricultural region for the capital's survival. It wasn't just that Egypt produced grain, it produced surplus, in such quantities and reliability that emperors came to depend on it like clockwork. To control Egypt was to control the bread of Rome. In fact, Augustus, after defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, placed Egypt under his personal control. Unlike other provinces, it wasn't governed by a senator, but by a prefect appointed directly by the emperor. No Roman senator was even allowed to enter Egypt without imperial permission. Such was the fear of losing control of the empire's pantry. Each year, Egypt exported hundreds of thousands of tons of northward wheat that grew in the silty, black earth renewed annually by the Nile's flood. The Nile was not only fertile, but navigable, turning Egypt into a natural conveyor belt. Wheat grown in the southern provinces of Thebade or Hermopolis was loaded onto barges, floated north to Alexandria, and then transferred to Roman freighters. Let us imagine the scene. The city of Alexandria, second only to Rome in size, wealth, and chaos. The great harbor bustled with activity. Grain flowed in by barge, unloaded by teams of men who worked barefoot, bare-chested in the baking sun. The air was thick with dust and the calls of seagulls. At the center of it all stood the colossal Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. its beacon a silent witness to 1,000 cargoes passing in and out. Here in Alexandria, Lucius, our grain ship owner from Ostia, might arrive in person once or twice a year to oversee a major shipment. The journey from Rome to Alexandria was long but direct, thanks to the Etesian winds that blew north to south during the summer months. These winds made sailing from Italy to Egypt smooth. The return trip, however, was far more difficult and time-consuming, since it had to fight the prevailing wind patterns. Lucius didn't load the grain himself. That was the job of Egypt's own bureaucrats, port agents, and scribes. The Egyptians had a detailed system of grain accounting, going back to pharaonic times. Each shipment was inspected, weighed, and sealed with wax or clay stamps, many of which bore the names of imperial officials. Alexandria's grain warehouses, the Horia Alexandrina, were enormous, cool structures designed to minimize spoilage. Some had drainage channels, elevated floors, and roof ventilation. The management of these warehouses was critical. Rats, mold, or humidity could destroy entire shipments before they even reached open water. Taxes played a large role in the grain supply chain. Farmers across Egypt paid a significant portion of their taxes in grain, not coin. These grain taxes, vectigalia frumentaria, were funneled into imperial stocks, then shipped to Rome. This wasn't a free market economy. It was a command economy engineered to keep the capital fed. For Lucius, this meant dealing with port administrators, bribing petty officials to speed along approvals, and enduring endless bureaucratic scrutiny. Everything was measured. Everything was recorded. Receipts were written on papyrus and stored in state archives, many of which survive to this day in the sands of Egypt. Despite the red tape, Alexandria was a marvel of imperial logistics. The grain was loaded onto special freighters, many of them designed specifically for long-haul bulk shipping. These ships, known as naves frumentarii, were among the largest commercial vessels in antiquity. Some could carry up to 400 tons of grain, enough to feed thousands for weeks. Their construction reflected their purpose. They had thick hulls, wide beams, and reinforced cross timbers. They were built not for speed but for endurance. Some were owned by wealthy negotiators, grain contractors, others by the state itself. Still others were chartered seasonally by men like Lucius, who leased vessels and crew for individual shipments. Each ship was loaded with care. The bottom of the hold was lined with dry straw, then grain sacks were stacked in staggered rows to prevent shifting. Cargo had to be balanced to ensure the ship sat properly in the water. Too front-heavy, and the bow would dip dangerously in waves. Too light in the stern, and the rudder would lose effectiveness. The departure from Alexandria was considered an event of imperial importance. Local priests performed rituals for favorable winds. Some ships were blessed with incense or had sacred inscriptions painted on their prows. The imperial prefect personally reviewed large shipments, especially those bound for official grain distributions. And then the waiting. Sailing north from Egypt meant battling wind and current. The route typically hugged the coast: Alexandria to Crete, Crete to Sicily, Sicily to Ostia. Ships often anchored in bays or harbors overnight, timing their sails for favorable conditions. A well-placed storm could delay a voyage by weeks. A broken rudder, an infestation of rats, or a spoiled cargo could destroy a merchant's fortune. Lucius, if aboard, would have spent his time checking the manifest, rationing food, and keeping an anxious eye on the horizon. At night, the sailors steered by stars, watching for familiar constellations like Ursa Major or Orion. At dawn, they scanned for shorelines and pirates. Yes, even in the 2nd century, piracy remained a problem. Though the Mediterranean was far safer under Roman rule than in the Republic's earlier centuries, rogue fleets still prowled the waters between Crete and Rhodes. Most grain ships traveled in convoys or under escort. Imperial grain was too valuable to risk. Upon arrival at Ostia, assuming no disasters had occurred, Lucius' cargo underwent another inspection. Any spoilage or shortages had to be explained. Payment, whether from private clients or the state, was conditional on delivery. If the ship was damaged or late, the locatio conductio shipping contract might include penalties. If all went well, Lucius might earn a modest profit. Grain shipping was not a path to riches, but to respectability and stability, the Roman virtues. Merchants who succeeded could rise socially, marry into minor equestrian families, or even win citizenship if they were freedmen. Still, profits fluctuated. Competition was fierce. Ships broke down. Bureaucrats changed policies mid-year. Grain prices rose and fell based on harvests, wars, and imperial whims. It was a business of patience and attrition. One might ask, why did Rome produce its own grain? The answer lies in climate, soil, and demand. Italy could never match Egypt's agricultural output. Its fields were patchier, its harvests more volatile. And by the 2nd century, much of Italy's land had been taken over by vineyards, olive groves, and livestock, all more profitable than wheat. Grain was outsourced, and Egypt bore the weight of that decision. Over time, this reliance created tension. Egyptian farmers grumbled about their grain quotas. Roman officials feared provincial revolts. A single failed Nile flood could spark shortages in Rome. The entire system hung delicately between weather, cooperation, and infrastructure. Lucius understood this balance. He lived it. Every filled sack, every wax seal, every harbor crossing was part of a fragile machine, a machine too vast for any one man to see entirely, but small enough for him to feel in every torn sail, every waterlogged cargo. As he stood on the dock, watching his crew finish unloading at Ostia, he might have allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The grain had arrived. Rome would eat. But even then, he knew, in a few weeks the cycle would begin again. The ships would need repairs. Contracts would need renewing. The grain would wait in Alexandria. And the winds, always the winds, would determine everything. Rome could not live without grain. And for centuries, it didn't have to. From the time of Augustus until well into the 4th century CE, the empire's grain supply, especially to the capital, functioned with astonishing consistency. Bureaucrats tracked every shipment, engineers maintained the ports, and generations of merchants like Lucius ensured the sea lanes remained filled with full cargo holds and empty promises of calm seas. But no system lasts forever. The decline of Rome's grain supply was not caused by a single disaster. Rather, it was a long erosion and accumulation of pressures, mistakes, and misfortunes that stretched over centuries. And for those whose lives depended on the system, from sailors to bakers to the families lining up at the grain dole, this slow unraveling was felt not in grand historical terms, but in empty bowls and shortened rations. Let us return to Ostia, but this time in the late 4th century. The docks are still in use but quieter. Warehouses stand partially empty. The once crowded causeways into the city of Rome carry fewer carts. Some ships arrive late, others never arrive at all. Grain from Egypt has grown irregular. The Nile's floods are unpredictable, the political situation fragile. In 330 CE, Emperor Constantine the Great moved the imperial capital to Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople. While Rome remained symbolically important, Constantinople, with its own hungry population, became a rival for grain. More and more shipments were diverted east. Even more critical was a decision made in the 5th century: the separation of the Eastern and Western Roman empires into two administrative entities. Egypt remained with the Eastern Empire. Rome, the old capital, belonged to the West. It was a logistical fracture with devastating consequences. No longer protected by centralized coordination, the Western Empire found itself scrambling to secure grain from elsewhere. North Africa, particularly Carthage, became its fallback, a region already productive, but now tasked with feeding an increasingly unstable Western world. Lucius's descendants, if still in the trade, now looked south rather than east. Carthage, like Alexandria before it, became vital. The ships grew larger, the contracts more desperate, and the risks more intense. Pirates returned with renewed vigor as imperial naval patrols grew sparse. Storms were less forgiving. And then came the Vandals. In 439 CE, the Vandal king Genseric seized Carthage. The Western Roman Empire lost not just a city but a breadbasket. The effect was immediate. Grain shipments to Italy slowed to a trickle. Panic set in. Contemporary sources describe food shortages, hoarding, and soaring prices. The grain dole, that ancient institution dating back to the Gracchi, was suspended. The very rhythm of urban Roman life changed. Bakeries closed. Bread lines vanished. Temples, once lit by offerings of wheat, stood dark and cold. For centuries, the Cura Annani, the administration responsible for grain distribution, had symbolized Rome's greatness. Now it became a hollow institution, its granaries underfilled, its clerks reassigned or dismissed. The infrastructure crumbled. Aqueducts fell into disrepair. Roads grew dangerous. Ships sat rotting at anchor or never returned. It is in this climate, both literal and political, that Rome truly began to shrink. By the early 5th century, the city's population had dropped from over 1 million to fewer than 200,000. The cause? Partly war, partly plague, but mostly hunger. Without grain, the city could not sustain itself. The grand urban experiment was unraveling. In 410 CE, Alaric and the Visigoths famously sacked Rome. Though the event shocked the empire, the real damage had been done already, quietly, by years of missed shipments and breadless mornings. The sack was a symptom, not a cause. Even after Carthage's loss, desperate attempts were made to redirect grain. Sicily, once marginal in the supply chain, was pressed into service. Its output was helpful but limited. The terrain was mountainous, its harvests inconsistent. Lucius would have scoffed at the idea of Sicily feeding Rome alone. Some cities developed localized systems, small-scale grain stores, private bakeries, and regional contracts. But these were patches, not repairs. The golden age of coordinated imperial supply was over. The grain ship, once a symbol of Roman logistical genius, became a ghost. Still, some held out hope. In 468 CE, the Western Empire launched a massive naval campaign to retake Carthage from the Vandals. The goal was not just strategic, it was nutritional. If Carthage could be recovered, the grain might flow again. But the campaign failed. The Western treasury, already depleted, could not fund another attempt. Within a few years, the empire itself would collapse. In 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire officially ended. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus. The old institutions, the Senate, the legions, the annona, faded into irrelevance. Rome was no longer the center of a mighty empire. It was a provincial town in a broken world. And yet, despite everything, people still ate bread. Grain still moved in smaller quantities through local networks. Monasteries began growing and grinding their own. Cities shrank, but villages adapted. The great empire had fallen, but human hunger and the quiet ingenuity that answered it endured. In this way, the grain ship never truly vanished. It transformed. In the East, under the Byzantines, the annona was reimagined. Grain continued to flow into Constantinople from Egypt and later, Anatolia. Though the old Roman world died in the West, echoes of its systems lingered in the East for nearly 1,000 more years. Perhaps, somewhere in those later centuries, a descendant of Lucius stood on a dock in Constantinople, inspecting a shipment of wheat from the Black Sea. Perhaps he too cursed the wind, or bribed an official, or oversaw the careful stacking of sacks into a creaking hull. History forgets most of these men. They left no poems, no sculptures, no epic tales, but their work, tedious, necessary, and profoundly uncelebrated, fed civilizations. The Roman Empire is remembered for its legions, its laws, its marble. But it endured for so long, in part, because of grain and because of the ships and sailors and scribes who moved it. And so, next time you hear of emperors or conquests or golden ages, pause and consider. How many of those stories would have unfolded if the docks of Alexandria had sat empty, if the wind had refused to rise? Because in the end, the empire did not fall in a day. It fell slowly, by the sack and then by the lack of one. Reflection. The fall of empires is often told in battles and assassinations, but this story reminds us that power also collapses when the bread runs out. Rome's greatness was not only built on marble and blood, but on logistics' quiet, repetitive, essential work that fed millions. The grain ships, largely forgotten by popular history, offer a humbling lesson. Sometimes, the most important thing in a civilization is not the sword or the scepter, but the sack of wheat delivered on time. Story 3. Laundry in Ancient Babylon. Soap, clay, and ashes. Before there were washing machines, detergent pods, or scented fabric softeners, there were clay basins, ash lye, and the calloused hands of men and women scrubbing textiles in the sun. In ancient Babylon, long before Rome was even a village, laundry was already a professional occupation, vital to city life, commerce, and cleanliness. It was not glamorous work. It was wet, messy, physically punishing, and often carried out by people of low social status. But it was also essential. Clothing and textiles were expensive in the ancient world, often handed down, mended, and repaired. Keeping them clean extended their life and preserved dignity, both personal and civic. A society built on priestly rituals, bureaucratic record-keeping, and hierarchical order could not function amid unwashed linens. In this section, we descend into the lesser-known world of Babylonian, fullers, the ancient washers who labored along canals and courtyards under the hot Mesopotamian sun. A city of mudbrick, reed, and soap. The city of Babylon, at its height around the 6th century BCE, was a sprawling urban center of perhaps 200,000 people, massive for its time. Built largely from mudbrick and baked clay, the city was laced with a network of canals fed by the Euphrates. These canals served as the city's arteries, moving water, cargo, waste, and labor. Near one such canal, behind the rows of merchant homes and temple complexes, one might find a small courtyard or workspace marked by a sour, soapy smell. Clay troughs lined the walls, stained from years of use. Reed baskets held soiled tunics and woolen robes, and beside a low fire sat a blackened pot filled with bubbling white sludge, the soap. The soap of ancient Babylon was not a store-bought bar. It was a crude but effective substance made from mixing water, wood ash, and animal fat. The result was a gelatinous alkaline paste, harsh on skin but strong on grease and dirt. This ash lye was the ancient forerunner of lye soap, known to have been used as early as 2800 BCE in Sumer and refined over centuries. Washers, men, women, sometimes slaves, would apply this lye paste to garments, scrub them with flat stones or paddles, and rinse them thoroughly in canal water. Depending on the textile, some garments required beating, others twisting, and some, especially wool, gentle handling to prevent shrinking or felting. The process was time-consuming. A single robe could take over an hour to clean fully. Woolen garments were the most difficult. They trapped dust, sweat, oil, and insects. Linen, while easier to clean, was prized and treated carefully. Dyed textiles posed their own challenges, as harsh soaps could bleach out expensive colors. The washers had to understand these differences instinctively. And they did. Fullers and the first service economy. The profession of laundry worker was well established in Mesopotamian urban life. Texts from the city of Ur, older even than Babylon, refer to workers known as abu, or fullers, who offered laundry services for temples, palaces, and private clients. Babylon inherited and expanded this tradition. The city's labor was deeply stratified. High-status individuals, priests, scribes, military officials did not wash their own garments, nor did merchants with reputations to protect. Clean clothing was a mark of respectability and order. Just as scribes preserved language and builders preserved walls, the fullers preserved fabric. There was an entire economy built around the washing and care of cloth. In some cases, fullers partnered with weavers or tailors. A garment might pass from spinner to dyer to washer before reaching its final owner. In temple districts, where priests changed ritual garments frequently, laundry workers were sometimes permanently stationed to wash and maintain sacred clothing, white linen tunics used in purification ceremonies, or dyed garments worn in processions. Many fullers worked as independent tradespeople. Others were slaves or servants within wealthy households. Some operated in guild-like groups, pooling labor and equipment. In larger compounds, one could find long basins, clay-lined trenches used for group washing, and a raised drying area with pegs or wooden frames for stretching cloth. Despite their importance, fullers were considered low status. They were often associated with filth and foul odors. Babylonian medical texts even mention skin ailments specific to those who handled lye and damp clothing, rashes, cracked hands, respiratory irritation. The bitter irony was that those who made others clean were often considered dirty themselves. The tools of the trade. The Babylonian washer's toolkit was simple but effective. Lye paste, made from wood ash and water mixed with animal fat. Ash was collected from household fires or kilns. The fat came from mutton, goat, or oxen. Scrubbing stones or boards. Flat, smooth stones used to grind dirt from fabric. In some cases, pieces of broken pottery or clay bricks served this purpose. Rinsing channels. Small canals or basins with flowing water were ideal for removing soap residue. The Euphrates Canal system made this feasible within city limits. Drying lines. Reeds, wood frames, or pegs along sunlit walls were used to dry and air out garments. Beating clubs or mallets. For particularly dirty or heavy cloths, especially rugs or cloaks, fullers used wooden mallets to pound out dirt and moisture. Laundry was rarely a solitary act. Most fullers worked in pairs or groups, passing garments from one stage to the next. A typical workflow might begin with a quick inspection, followed by a first scrub, then a lye soak, then another scrub, a rinse, and finally drying and folding. Some added perfumes to the rinse water, crushed herbs like thyme or fenugreek, or infusions of cedar oil when available. These were not just for scent but for insect repellent. In a hot climate with limited bathing, clean-smelling clothes were a subtle form of social currency. Dirty laundry and temple life. Temples in Babylon were not just religious centers, they were economic powerhouses. The great ziggurat of Etemenenki, dedicated to Marduk, employed scores of personnel: priests, administrators, laborers, cooks, and yes, fullers. Ritual garments used by priests had to be immaculate. Purity laws dictated that garments used in offerings or festivals could not be stained or soiled. Specific instructions for cleaning these garments appear in temple administrative texts. For example, records from nearby Sippar list fullers receiving woolen robes, washing them under priestly supervision, and returning them in bundles marked with wax seals. In some cases, fullers were required to account for lost items, a sign that even in ancient Mesopotamia, laundry mishaps were a risk. And then there was the issue of urine. Yes, urine. In many ancient cultures, including Babylon, urine was used as a natural source of ammonia, a powerful cleaning agent. Though less documented in Babylon than in Roman or Greek sources, it is likely that fullers used urine collected from chamber pots or alleyways to bleach and clean certain fabrics. The smell, naturally, was unforgettable. This use of urine may also explain the social stigma attached to fullers. In cuneiform tablets, They are sometimes listed alongside tanners, dyers, and butchers, all professions associated with strong odors, impurity, and low status. And yet, despite this, they were indispensable. As Babylon thrived, a city of scribes and soldiers, merchants and magistrates, none of them could operate for long without clean garments. The fullers made sure of that. Day after day, garment after garment, they scrubbed, rinsed, and hung their efforts to dry under the Mesopotamian sun. But as the garments flapped in the wind, and as the soap dripped from stone basins, a question lingered. In a civilization so obsessed with order, purity, and ritual, why were those who preserved cleanliness so often cast into the shadows? The scent of wood ash, lye, and wet wool drifted through the air like a forgotten perfume of labor. In Babylon, the act of washing clothing was more than a routine chore. It was tied to status, sanitation, religion, and ritual. It existed at the crossroads between the sacred and the profane, and at the center of it all were the launderers, invisible in records, indispensable in practice. As the city's scribes meticulously recorded contracts and grain tallies in cuneiform, the fullers toiled without fanfare. They left no great inscriptions, no poems, no statues. Their presence is found instead in scattered tablets, economic receipts, and the corners of larger administrative texts, margin figures in an empire obsessed with accounting. But what was it that made laundry such a curious blend of essential and shameful? Social tiers, soiled tunics. In Babylonian society, professions were often ranked by proximity to purity. At the top stood the priesthood, whose role in state-sanctioned ritual life granted them untouchable status both literally and figuratively. Below them were scribes, administrators, military officers, and skilled artisans. Fullers occupied a lower tier. They were rarely free professionals in the modern sense. Some were temple laborers. Others were property-enslaved people or bonded workers. Even when they operated independently, they worked in designated quarters of the city near canals, or in the less fashionable districts where industrial tasks were concentrated. This wasn't unique to Babylon. Across the ancient Near East, occupations that dealt with bodily substances, waste, blood, or in this case, urine and lye, were stigmatized. The fuller's work often involved handling filthy, infected, or worn garments, and their tools lye made from ash, rinse basins thick with runoff, urine jars hidden behind screens made their workspace deeply unpleasant to outsiders. Despite this, wealthier Babylonians depended on them. The paradox was clear. The higher a person's social rank, the less they would wash their own clothing. So they turned to those in the lowest ranks to perform a task fundamental to maintaining their image. In some legal documents, fines for damaging garments during washing were specified. If a fuller returned a linen tunic shrunk or discolored, restitution was expected. The garment might be valued in silver shekels, and the fuller required to repay the loss even if the soap had worked as intended. In effect, Babylonian fullers not only cleaned clothing, they carried the financial risk of doing it wrong. Soap stains in science. The techniques of ancient Babylonian laundering were surprisingly advanced for their time. While they lacked modern knowledge of bacteria or fiber chemistry, centuries of empirical trial and error had honed their methods. They knew that ash from certain trees produced a stronger lye. Palm wood, for instance, created a soft alkaline solution, while tamarisk ash was harsher. Some combined ash with chalky sediments scraped from canal beds, thickening the lye paste for use on coarse fabrics like wool cloaks or working-class tunics. Clay tablets from Nippur, a Sumerian city, absorbed into Babylonian influence, describe recipes for cleaning and treating wool. These included ash paste mixed with sesame oil for lifting grease stains, soaking in sour beer or vinegar to treat discoloration, boiling garments in water mixed with crushed soapwort root, which produced a natural foaming agent, adding powdered sulfur or natron, a natural soda for bleaching white linen. Certain rituals required absolutely pure garments, not just visually clean, but ritually unblemished. If a priest's robe had been touched by blood or feces, even after washing, it could be deemed unsuitable. In such cases, the garment might be ritually burned rather than cleaned. This led to an unusual practice: preemptive laundering. Before major festivals, wealthy families and temples sent garments for cleaning whether or not they were visibly soiled. The assumption was that unseen impurity lingered spiritual residue, and only a thorough, ritualistically aware washing could remove it. Some scholars believe that fullers themselves were taught purification rites, especially if they worked in temple contexts. While no direct fuller's manual survives, fragments of liturgical texts suggest that launderers working for temples may have recited protective prayers, burned incense near the wash basins, or abstained from certain foods during holy periods. A job of soap and sweat became, in such contexts, a sacred act. The marketplace of cleanliness. In the secular world, laundering was transactional. At Babylon's markets, people could hire fullers by the piece or by the bundle. A standard rate might be 1 of silver for 10 garments or less for bulk orders. Slaves sent by merchant households often delivered clothes in woven baskets marked with wooden tags identifying the owner. In busy seasons, festival weeks, weddings, or royal visits, fullers raised prices, knowing demand was high. Some fullers specialized in certain types of fabric. One might focus on white linens, another on wool cloaks. A few became known for their ability to remove wine stains or restore faded dyes. Reputation mattered. But so did discretion. Some wealthier Babylonians employed launderers not just for cleanliness but for concealment. The accidental staining of a garment with blood, for example, might raise questions, and questions invited risk. Fullers were occasionally drawn into legal disputes, asked to testify about what they had cleaned. A wine merchant accused of assault might have his tunic examined by a fuller, not forensically, as in modern trials, but narratively. Yes, the fuller might be asked, was the stain old? Was it wine? Or something else? These moments remind us how closely cleanliness, shame, and evidence intertwined. Women and washing. While most written sources use masculine forms for fullers, archaeological evidence suggests that women participated heavily in laundering, especially within households, temples, and in communal washing quarters. Laundry was among the most grueling domestic tasks assigned to enslaved women. In palace archives from Mari and Ashur, enslaved laundrywomen are listed by name, assigned to specific masters or departments. They were responsible not only for washing, but also for mending and folding garments, a full life cycle of textile maintenance. Women may have also run small laundry businesses from their homes. In dense urban quarters, where space was limited, it's possible that doorfront tubs or courtyards doubled as washing stations. Families could drop off soiled cloth, pay in grain or fish, and retrieve clean, pressed garments the next day. Their contributions, though undocumented in official texts, were likely immense, another reminder of the invisible scaffolding beneath ancient society. The river and the ritual. Despite the grime, the sweat, the stigma, and the risk, laundering in Babylon held one undeniable virtue: water. To wash clothes in the canal was to commune with the life-giving flow of the Euphrates. Fullers stood barefoot in its shallows, garments clinging to their skin, the sun heating their backs. They spoke, gossiped, argued. They watched boats drift past, listened to the calls of fishmongers and herdsmen, and beat the dust of empire out of tunics with rhythmic slaps. And when the work was done, they rinsed their own arms and faces in the same current, stepped out onto the banks, and stretched beneath a sky that had seen kings rise and fall. It was a small life, but it was theirs. And as they folded one final robe, pinning it with a reed splint, they might have paused just briefly to consider that cleanliness, though often thankless, was a form of resistance. Against decay, against disorder, against being forgotten. But what happened to these launderers when Babylon's canals dried, its markets emptied, and its ziggurats crumbled into dust? As empires fall, so too do their quiet routines. For the launderers of ancient Babylon, men and women who stood ankle-deep in canal water and scrubbed away the dust of daily life, the collapse came not with a single blow, but in a slow and muddy ebb. The sun still rose, the canals still flowed, but the work began to thin. Fatting waters and shifting powers. By the time the Persians under Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, the city was already straining. Its legendary grandeur, the walls, the temples, the hanging gardens had become burdens as much as boasts. Maintaining such a vast urban space required tax, labor, and logistics on a scale few regimes could sustain. But the Persians were not destroyers. They preserved much of Babylon's administrative structure. Laundry work continued. Fullers still operated under temple contracts and private arrangements. The canals were dredged, maintained, and used. Clean garments still mattered, especially in Zoroastrian and Babylonian rites that emphasized purity. Yet the seeds of change had been planted. As the Persian Empire grew, Babylon became one city among many. Resources shifted toward Persepolis, Susa, and Ecbatana. Elite families moved. Administrative attention drifted elsewhere. Over the next 2 centuries, Babylon's status slipped. Wealthy households who once employed fullers began to rely on smaller household labor. The larger communal laundries, those near the central canals, saw fewer garments. Temple laundries, too, diminished in importance as religious practices evolved. Some rituals faded, others adapted, and some, as in the case of Marduk's great ziggurat, Edhemenenki, ceased altogether when the temple complex was partially dismantled under later rulers. Still, the fullers remained. Their work was too fundamental to disappear overnight. So long as cloth existed, so too did the need to wash it. In lean times, they bartered their services: a basket of clean linens for a sack of barley, a scrubbed wool cloak for a pair of sandals. The language of coin gave way to survival. Alexander and the Broken Empire. When Alexander the Great marched into Babylon in 331 BCE, the city opened its gates without resistance. He treated it with surprising reverence, ordering repairs to the temples and honoring local gods. For a brief moment, Babylon flickered again with energy. Traders returned. Soldiers flooded in. Rituals resumed. And the launderers found work once more. Military campaigns generated endless laundry. Soldiers required tunics cleaned of sweat, mud, and blood. Officers needed cloaks presentable for formal inspections. And Alexander's own court, with its mixture of Macedonian and Persian styles, offered new textiles and new challenges. But the revival was brief. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire shattered. Babylon was tugged between rival generals, each of whom plundered, promised, and then abandoned the city in turn. Eventually, the Seleucid kings established a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, drawing trade and influence away. Babylon, by the 2nd century BCE, was in decline. Its canals became clogged with silt, its temples crumbled, its streets grew quiet. The fullers once crowded near the water's edge now worked sporadically. The grand basins cracked. The rinse channels dried. What laundry work remained shifted to nearby towns or nomadic settlements. Clay tablets no longer mentioned laundry contracts. Temple accounts no longer listed soap deliveries. Some fullers moved with the shifting population, following clients or seeking temple work elsewhere in Uruk, Borsippa, or even further east. Others simply faded into anonymity. We do not know their names. But in one final cuneiform record from the 1st century BCE, a scribe mentions the basin near the canal that was used for garments during the time of the old festivals. It's a passing reference, a memory of soap, of labor, of lives no longer needed. And then silence, the forgotten profession. Laundry did not disappear from the Near East, of course. As new empires rose, Parthians, Sasanians, eventually the Islamic caliphates, the need for clean clothing endured. But the profession changed shape, name, and status. By the time medieval Arab geographers wrote of Mesopotamian cities, Babylon was already a ruin. Travelers marveled at its size but not its soap. No one noted the launderers. Their knowledge, once passed hand to hand through generations, had been replaced or lost. And yet the echoes remain. Archaeological excavations at Babylon have uncovered clay basins stained with residue likely from soap making or fulling. Kilns nearby may have produced the ash. Grinding stones and paddle tools, worn smooth from centuries of use, speak to repetitive, skilled labor. These remnants tell us something critical. That the mundane, the overlooked, the daily, these too deserve remembrance. Because while kings debated in their palaces, while scribes etched laws in clay, someone else stood in the mud, scrubbing a hem, turning a stained tunic back into something useful, respectable, even sacred. A reflection in the water. When we think of ancient Babylon, we picture ziggurats, astronomers, and armies. But there were also soap makers. There were women boiling water over open fires. There were slaves beating tunics on stones. There were children hanging wet robes on lines of braided reed. There were fullers proud or weary, skilled or scorned, who made civilization possible in the quietest of ways. They did not write epics, they did not build monuments, but they made the priests presentable for rituals. They gave scribes clean robes for court. They sent merchants into the bazaar without the stink of labor clinging to them. They gave dignity to the daily. And when their time passed, when the canals dried and the last soap basin cracked in the sun, no one wrote their eulogy. So let us write it now. Reflection. History is often told through marble and conquest, but it's the soap makers, the launderers, and the fullers who remind us what truly sustains a civilization. They labored in the background, invisible in fame but essential in function. In the story of ancient Babylon, they are a quiet thread, not grand but enduring. And in the stillness of a forgotten canal, where clay meets dust, their story lingers, a soft echo of water, ash, and care. Story 4. The Toll Collectors of Medieval France. If you were a traveler moving through the Kingdom of France sometime in the 13th century, you would have quickly learned to carry more than just provisions. You would need patience, a pouch of assorted coins, and a careful mental tally of every bridge, gate, or river crossing along your route. Because in medieval France, movement came at a price. The land was crisscrossed with toll stations, small wooden booths, stone archways, river barges with hanging chains, each one manned by a toll collector who demanded payment in exchange for passage. These were not merely road fees. They were a fundamental part of the feudal economic system, a network of minor powers extracting small sums from every passing cart, herd, or pair of boots. Behind these countless interruptions stood a figure rarely remembered, the toll collector. Neither noble nor peasant, neither merchant nor outlaw, he stood somewhere in between, a functionary of a system as old as feudalism itself. He was the man who blocked the road. Let us step into his world. A man, a booth, and a barrier. Imagine a narrow bridge over the Seine River near the town of Macon. The bridge is old but sturdy, built of stone in the previous century. On either end stands a wooden structure no more than a glorified shack with a small iron brazier for heat and a set of iron weights for measuring goods. Inside sits Etienne, a toll collector. He is not a nobleman, though his job is technically under the authority of a local seigneur. He may be literate, though not necessarily fluent in Latin. He owns little a thick wool cloak, a worn ledger, a set of scales, and a collection of coins in a locked chest. His main tool is his presence. Each day he wakes early and takes his post. His job is simple: assess travelers, collect fees, and keep records. But in reality, the job is anything but simple. A farmer with a cart of apples approaches 2 deniers for a single axle and 4 measures of produce. Etienne collects, writes the amount into the ledger, and gives a crude paper receipt, stamped with wax and the local lord's seal. Next comes a group of shepherds moving 40 sheep to a nearby town for market. That's 2 sous for the animals, 1 for the shepherds. One protests, claims he paid at the last bridge. Etienne argues. Eventually, a reduced toll is agreed upon. The sheep shuffle on. Then a monk approaches, walking alone with nothing but a small satchel, technically exempt as a man of the church. Etienne lets him pass, offering a respectful nod. And so it goes, hour after hour. The toll system, feudal economics in action. Tolls or peages were not a Roman invention, nor were they centrally planned. Instead, they evolved haphazardly across medieval Europe, growing out of feudal rights and privileges. In France, by the 11th century, many lords claimed the right to impose tolls on roads, rivers, and bridges within their domains. Some of these tolls were ancient, others had been imposed arbitrarily. A nobleman might declare that anyone crossing his land must pay whether or not he maintained the road. And so, with no central oversight, toll booths multiplied. Toll collectors were the frontline agents of this system. Appointed by the landowner or municipal authority, they were expected to be vigilant, honest, and firm. In practice, they were often overworked, underpaid, and caught between angry travelers and demanding lords. Tolls came in many forms. Land tolls, for using a road or path. Bridge tolls, for crossing a man-made span. River tolls, for using ferries or transporting goods by boat. Market tolls, for selling or even displaying goods in a town. Gate tolls, for entering walled cities or castles. Pack animal tolls, often calculated by the number and type of beasts. Each toll had its own rate, measured in deniers, sous, or even in kind goods like fish, wool, or chickens. Rates could change with the season or the mood of the collector's superior. Etienne kept a chart pinned to the inside wall of his booth, a crude ink drawing listing common toll rates. Merchants on foot with 1 mule, 1 denier. Ox cart carrying wine, 3 sous. Noble retinue on horseback, toll exempt unless the lord said otherwise. Over time, certain groups like pilgrims, clergy, or royal messengers were granted exemptions. Some monasteries even kept official documents known as franchises, proving their immunity from local tolls. Etienne had learned to check these closely. Forgeries were not uncommon. The life of a toll collector. Etienne's day was repetitive and cold. In the summer, flies swarmed around the booth. In winter, snow piled against the door. Rain turned the road into a ribbon of mud. Still, he sat there recording, arguing, collecting. He drank weak beer from a wooden cup, ate salted pork from a clay dish, and scratched lines into the dirt to track hours. He lived in a small cottage nearby owned by the lord, like the land, the booth, and even the road itself. He was paid a modest salary and allowed to keep a fraction of the tolls, an incentive system prone to abuse. Some toll collectors grew wealthy by padding the books, demanding extra fees or pocketing payments. Etienne, to his credit, did not. He feared inspection. Every few months, a steward arrived from the lord's estate to audit the toll station. He reviewed the ledgers, counted the coin, and checked the seal. Any discrepancy had to be explained. Etienne once heard of a collector who had shorted the count by a dozen deniers. The steward cut off 2 of his fingers. Toll collection, it turned out, could be dangerous in more ways than one. Travelers and tensions. Not everyone accepted the legitimacy of tolls. Merchants resented them, especially when multiple tolls existed along a short route. Some cities negotiated toll-free corridors with local lords, offering annual payments in exchange for unhindered trade. These agreements were sometimes honored, often they were not. Violence was a constant threat. Robbers sometimes posed as toll collectors. Real collectors were sometimes robbed. Traveling merchants occasionally banded together to protest or bribe their way past. There are recorded cases of entire caravans refusing to pay a toll, overwhelming the booth, and moving on unchallenged. Etienne had never faced such an incident himself, but he kept a dagger under his cloak and a whistle on a leather cord. If attacked, he was to blow 3 times, a signal to the nearby watch. Help might arrive in an hour or not at all. And then there were the nobles. High-ranking lords passed without paying, sometimes forcing Etienne to open the barrier without even a nod. Their retinues clattered across the bridge in armor and fine cloaks, ignoring him entirely. Still, he marked their passage in the ledger as required. Noble party, 20 men, unpaid, under privilege. The ledger mattered. It was a logbook not just of coin, but of power. And at the end of each week, as Etienne sat by candlelight copying the totals into a second book for the steward, he wondered, was the road truly the Lord's to charge for, or did it belong to those who walked it? The toll booth smelled of wax, wet wool, and stale breath. Etienne dipped the quill in the inkwell for the 6th time that morning, blotting the paper carefully as he copied the names of 2 fishmongers, 4 cart animals, and the goods. Herrings, salted, 2 barrels, paid, 3 deniers. He glanced up from the page as the wind rattled the oilskin covering the booth's entrance. It was cold and the brazier had gone out. He reached for the iron poker and stirred the ashes. No flame. There was no time to relight it. A slow procession was arriving. Oxen, a cart, 2 women with large linen sacks. One of the women was already digging into a leather pouch she'd paid before. Etienne appreciated this. Efficiency, compliance, familiarity. But familiarity wasn't always safe. The complexity of tolls. In theory, tolls were straightforward. You used a road, crossed a bridge, or floated down a river. You paid a fee for the right to do so. The fee was determined by the type of traveler, their cargo, and the local authorities' decree. But by the 13th century, the system had become bewilderingly complex. Toll jurisdictions overlapped. On a single day's journey through the Rhone Valley, a merchant might pass through lands controlled by a bishopric, a secular lord, a monastic order, and a chartered commune, all of which claimed the right to levy tolls. Some travelers were taxed multiple times for the same goods. This led to the rise of the tariff scrolls, hand-copied lists of toll rates issued by various authorities. Etienne had a copy nailed to the interior of his booth. Most travelers couldn't read it, but Etienne could enough to make the required calculations. Still, it wasn't always that simple. Monks, for example, were often exempt, but only if they were on religious business. How was Etienne to know if a Benedictine abbey servant traveling with a mule load of rye was bound for the monastery or the open market? Jewish traders presented another complexity. Some local lords charged them double, others extended protections. Etienne had seen both policies enforced in the same region within a month. He followed the instructions of the steward, not his conscience. Pilgrims marked by scallop shells, wooden staffs, and rough cloaks were usually allowed to pass freely. But there were fakes among them, merchants posing as pilgrims to avoid tolls. One had once slipped through with bolts of fine cloth wrapped in a blanket. Etienne had been fined for that. And then there were nobles' retainers, who often claimed exemption under their master's authority, even when traveling without them. Corruption, resistance, and negotiation. It was no secret that toll collection was fertile ground for petty corruption. Many collectors, even honest ones, operated in the gray spaces between custom, law, and enforcement. Some took bribes to allow extra wagons through. Others inflated the rate for foreign merchants who didn't know local rules. Some created their own exemptions, charging locals less in exchange for food, wine, or favors. Etienne had once been offered a live chicken to let a farmer pass with 3 extra goats. He'd accepted not out of greed, but out of fatigue. It was easier than arguing. But there were rules. Too much deviation and the steward would notice. Each booth was audited every few months. Coin tallies were compared with the ledger. Discrepancies brought questions. Too many questions brought punishment. There was also resistance from the travelers. Some forged documents of exemption. Others simply bypassed toll roads entirely, using forest paths and river crossings. Bandits did the same not to avoid paying, but to avoid attention altogether. In response, some toll collectors hired guards. Others built fences or chains across the road. Etienne had a heavy iron chain that he stretched across the bridge at night, secured with a padlock. It squealed when dragged. He had to oil it weekly. Negotiation was the real art of the job. A widow with 2 geese begged exemption. Her husband had died. Etienne let her through. A Flemish trader with 5 donkeys demanded a reduced rate, said his goods were for the bishop's table. Etienne charged him full price. Every day was a series of compromises, judgments, and small risks. Too lenient and you were accused of weakness. Too harsh and you might be assaulted. Somewhere in the middle was survival. Toll collectors and lords. While toll collectors worked at the edge of society in lonely booths on muddy roads, they were agents of powerful systems. Every sou collected fed the purse of a noble family, a monastery, or a commune. This made toll collection politically sensitive. At Etienne's station, the lord of the land was Seigneur Bernard de Tournay, a minor noble with a crumbling manor and debts to repay. His steward visited once a season to demand the toll revenues. He arrived on horseback, trailed by 2 armed men, and inspected the coin chest personally. Etienne feared him. Everyone did. Once, a neighboring toll booth reported losses: stolen coin, a vandalized ledger, a burned lockbox. The steward accused the collector of fraud and sent him to the local magistrate. The booth stood empty for weeks afterward. Rumor said the man had been imprisoned or mutilated. Toll collectors were not protected. They served the powerful but were not among them. Even the church levied tolls in some areas, a reminder that spiritual authority did not exempt itself from the practicalities of governance. Monastic toll booths, while often better maintained, could be just as demanding. In a strange irony, many collectors, including Etienne, were devout themselves. He kept a carved wooden cross in his booth, tucked beside the inkpot. He recited prayers before sleeping, and on feast days he walked to the village chapel and lit a candle for forgiveness. Not forgiveness for any particular sin, just the daily compromises. The toll booth as a record of movement. The ledger was Etienne's most important possession. It was more than a book of accounts. It was a living record of who passed, what they carried, and where they were going. He wrote entries with care. March 12, wine merchant 2 carts 8 barrels, paid 6 sous. March 14, pilgrim on foot, no fee. March 16, Lord's messenger 3 riders, toll exempt. March 19, rain all day, no traffic. In this way, the toll booth captured the flow of medieval life in a way few other sources could. It was a checkpoint, a ledger, a bottleneck, and a mirror. Etienne once counted 27 animals in a single day: oxen, donkeys, goats, and 2 rare mules. Another day he saw none. The booth knew more than the village. It saw more than the manor. It listened silently to the gossip of passing strangers, of harvests, famines, wars, weddings, and rumors from far-off cities. It was, in its way, a crossroads of empire. And yet Etienne was painfully aware that none of it belonged to him. He owned no land. He passed no laws. He merely watched the road, recorded the passage, and collected the price. But as he turned the page of his ledger, dipping his pen in ink once more, he paused. Would anyone, years from now, care who had stood in the cold, taken the coin and kept the records. Would the toll collector be remembered? Or only the road? It was late summer when Etienne lowered the chain across the road for the last time. The days had grown shorter and the leaves on the trees beyond the bridge began to crisp and curl. The traffic was slower now. A harvest wagon or two. Fewer herds, fewer travelers. Word was spreading. The seigneur's son had returned from the court in Paris, and with him came new ideas, dangerous ones. That year change arrived not as revolution or decree, but as a quiet disuse. A toll unpaid, a chain no longer raised, a booth left uninspected. Etienne felt it in his bones. The fatting need for toll collectors. By the 14th century, the role of toll collectors across France had begun to shift. The reasons were many, and none dramatic on their own. But together, they marked a slow erosion of the system that had defined feudal mobility for centuries. Royal centralization. Kings, particularly Philip IV and his successors, increasingly sought to centralize authority. Royal roads, Kemen's Rogs, were granted exemption from many local tolls, creating protected corridors for merchants and messengers. Commerce and conflict. Growing towns and cities began to negotiate regional agreements to remove tolls altogether. They realized that toll-free trade routes attracted more merchants, more goods, and more taxes in other forms: market fees, licensing, and property rents. Corruption and complaint. Toll collectors, even the honest ones, had developed a reputation. Petitions to kings and bishops decried unfair rates, invented tolls, and false exemptions. Some toll booths were attacked and burned during peasant uprisings or urban riots. The Black Death. When plague swept across France in the mid-14th century, populations collapsed, trade slowed, and many toll stations were simply abandoned. Dead collectors were not replaced. Vacant booths rotted in place. And so, little by little, the collectors were forgotten. Some were folded into other roles: scribes, guards, tax clerks. Others vanished from the record entirely. The system didn't disappear overnight. In some places, tolls persisted well into the early modern period. But their reach diminished, their authority weakened, and their economic function replaced by more centralized forms of taxation. Etienne never lived to see the end of the system, but he sensed its decline. There was less oversight. The steward came late one quarter, then skipped the next altogether. The booth's thatch roof sagged. The seal on the ledger was no longer checked. One day, a noble's envoy passed through without even slowing down. Etienne stood, hand raised the signal for payment, but the envoy rode on, dust rising behind him. No one came back to collect the toll. The toll booth as relic. Years later, when the road had widened and the bridge was repaired in stone, a mason tore down Etienne's old booth. He found scraps of parchment, coins stuck between floorboards, and a rusted chain buried in the mud. The ledger was burned for kindling. The coins were melted. The tools were repurposed. The toll collector's name vanished into the soil. But the booth had done its work. For generations, it had captured the economic and social pulse of medieval France in scribbled records, in thumb-worn wax seals, and in the thousands of coins it had collected, weighed, and passed onward. It had stood witness to the migration of rural peasants to growing towns, the passage of monks and messengers, the slow movement of goods, salt, fish, wine, wool, iron, the evolution of trust and distrust between the state and its people. And perhaps most poignantly, it had embodied the logic of a world in which access had a price, and roads were not public but private. The human cost of passage. Etienne's story was not unique. Across medieval Europe, thousands like him sat behind low walls or within drafty booths, tasked with turning movement into money. Some skimmed profits. Others obeyed rules. All of them navigated a system that gave them just enough power to anger others, and just enough vulnerability to fear for themselves. They lived in the margins, neither noble nor serf, yet essential to the machine of feudal governance. Their job was bureaucratic, but their lives were physical. They worked in cold, wet, exposed places. They argued with strangers. They counted coppers by candlelight. They were required to know the value of everything that passed and the worth of nothing that stayed. They were middlemen of motion, gatekeepers of the everyday. And then they were gone. A road without chains. Today, when we imagine the Middle Ages, we see castles, knights, and plagues. But there were also toll collectors. Men like Etienne, who lived quiet lives of arithmetic and negotiation, who blocked the road not out of cruelty but obligation. In many ways, their disappearance marks a turning point in history. The slow shift from local to central authority, from fragmented to unified administration, from feudal privilege to common access. The decline of the toll booth was not the end of control, of course. It was merely the evolution of how power flowed from roadside coins to national taxes, from barriers of iron to borders on paper. But in that evolution, something curious was lost. The immediacy of transaction, the face at the gate, the ink-stained ledger that said yes or no. And so, as you walk a road today paved, open and free, remember the toll collector who once sat beside it, counting coins with stiff fingers, watching every traveler pass. Reflection. The toll collector's story is one of quiet constraint, a symbol of how the machinery of feudalism operated not in war or law alone, but in the ordinary exchange between walker and watcher. He is a figure of in-between, between classes, between destinations, between freedom and obligation. In remembering him, we remember that history is made not just by those who moved mountains, but by those who guarded the paths between them. Story 5. Salt roads and forgotten traders. Centuries before modern highways crisscrossed Europe, and long before railroads reshaped continents, an older kind of network tied distant communities together, a network made not of iron or asphalt, but of need. And at the heart of that need was salt. In the ancient and medieval world, salt was more than a seasoning. It was a preservative, a medicine, a religious offering, a currency, and for many, a daily necessity. Civilizations rose and fell with their ability to obtain and transport it. In places far from the sea or salt flats, salt had to be carried across hundreds of miles on the backs of animals and men. This was the domain of the salt traders, itinerant figures whose quiet labors sustained markets, kitchens, and empires. They left few written records. No monuments bear their names. But in the grooves worn into mountain passes, the weathered resting stones on old trails, and the faded toll records of sleepy hamlets, we can still glimpse the lives they led. Let us walk a few dusty miles in their worn leather boots. Salt, a quiet necessity. To truly understand the salt trade, one must first grasp its value. Salt preserved food in a time before refrigeration. It cured meat and fish, extending their shelf life by weeks or months. It was essential to make cheese and to prepare many herbal medicines. Livestock needed it too, and human bodies required it. A lack of salt could lead to confusion, cramps, even death. Regions near the sea or natural salt springs like the marshes of Brittany, the Camargue, or the Salzkammergut in Austria had relatively easy access. But those deep inland, especially in mountainous or forested terrain, had to rely on salt brought in from afar. Thus formed the salt roads via Salaria, the veins through which white gold flowed into the heartlands of Europe and beyond. By the early medieval period, entire regions had developed trading routes specifically for the movement of salt. These roads were not wide boulevards. They were narrow, often dangerous paths winding through forests, over hills, and across borders, and they were traveled by people whose lives depended entirely on what they carried. The trader and the trail. In the foothills of what is now southeastern France, around the 11th century, a man named Raymond would have woken before dawn. his breath rising in clouds as he packed his mule. Raymond was not a merchant in the sense of owning a shop or ledger. He was a transporter, a colporteur of sorts, a man who moved goods for others or in small quantities to be sold along the way. His focus was salt. He packed his mule with flat, grayish-white cakes of salt wrapped in burlap and tied with flax cords. The salt came from the evaporation ponds on the Mediterranean coast, collected, dried, and pressed into solid form for easier travel. Each block weighed several kilograms and was valuable enough to attract thieves, inspectors, and tax collectors in equal measure. His route took him northward through wooded valleys and over narrow bridges. The roads were poorly maintained. In summer they were choked with dust. In spring they dissolved into mud. In winter they vanished under snow. Still, he walked them year after year. He stopped at small villages to trade or sell. A farmer might offer dried beans or smoked trout in exchange for a block of salt. A midwife might pay in wool. In some cases, Raymond bartered directly with local inns a few cakes of salt for a warm meal and a place to sleep in the hayloft. The salt was currency, accepted even where coins were not. His journey was slow, calculated in leagues, not hours. Hazards on the salt road. The salt trade was not for the faint of heart. Beyond the physical toll of carrying or leading heavily laden animals over rough terrain, salt traders faced numerous threats. Bandits. Salt was compact, valuable, and easily sold. Bandits often targeted traders, especially those traveling alone. Many traders banded together into caravans for safety. Tolls and tariffs. Nearly every domain they passed through had its own system of tolls. Some were legal and posted. Others were invented on the spot. Local lords, abbeys, and even bandit chieftains claimed the right to tax goods passing through their land. Disease. Traders encountered many people and slept in shared spaces. Outbreaks of illness could spread quickly. Some travelers wore herbs or amulets to ward off sickness. Weather. A sudden storm could make a mountain pass impassable. Ice could destroy footpaths. Spring floods could sweep away bridges. Raymond knew these risks. He had a routine: always hide one block of salt, wear poor clothing to deter thieves, and carry a small wooden cross tied to his belt. He told people it was for protection, though it may also have served as a passport of sorts, marking him as a Christian man with implied rights of safe passage. Some abbeys and churches gave protection to traders, offering shelter and charging fair prices. Others simply turned them away. But Raymond had a route he trusted, a circuit of villages and clients who knew his face. He had walked it for 20 years. The quiet power of salt. Despite the humble appearance of the salt trader, his work had outsized impact. Entire regions depended on salt deliveries. Towns with regular salt access could preserve surplus food and survive harsh winters. Cheese making, an important industry in many monastic communities, required reliable access to salt for brining. Even basic bread recipes often included it. Markets were planned around salt deliveries. Fairs coincided with seasonal trade routes, and the presence of salt or the lack of it could determine a village's prosperity. In some cases, salt traders like Raymond were the only regular link between isolated communities and the wider world. They brought not just salt, but news. Word of distant famines, wars, royal decrees. Stories of weather, bandit attacks, marriages, and rumors of plague. Raymond once told a farmer's wife about a new type of salt cake being pressed near Marseille, lighter, with fewer impurities. He didn't know if it was true. He had only heard it from another trader in the lowlands. But the wife listened, as though he were a herald from the king. That, too, was the role of the salt trader, not only mover of goods, but carrier of memory and movement. As Raymond reached the next hamlet on his circuit, the sun dipped low behind the hills. Smoke rose from chimneys and children ran barefoot through the lanes. A woman waved to him from her doorway, already holding a basket of eggs. She knew what he had brought. Raymond smiled, touched his forehead, and called to his mule. And in that ordinary moment, the exchange of salt for food, for warmth, for trust, we glimpse a thread in the long fabric of human endurance. A life shaped not by conquest or decree, but by the quiet perseverance of dusty feet, winding paths, and the weight of white gold. The sky was barely pink when Raymond pushed open the gate of a small hilltop village. His boots were damp from morning dew. The mule's breath steamed in the cold. At the village edge, a narrow path curved around a small chapel and further down into the market square. The square was nothing grand, just a flattened bit of earth, rutted from wagon wheels, edged by a stone well and 4 wooden stalls. But on market days, it pulsed with life. The salt Raymond carried would soon pass from his hands into the village's quiet web of barter and need. Yet in this moment, it was still his wrapped tight in burlap, tied with twine, waiting for a buyer. Monasteries and the institutional need for salt. Among the most reliable salt customers in the medieval world were monasteries. While abbeys were often self-sufficient, they were also major economic engines. They brewed ale, made cheese, salted meat, and baked bread, all of which required regular supplies of salt. In some regions, monasteries held rights to salt springs or pans and managed the trade themselves. But in more isolated or inland areas, monks relied on itinerant traders like Raymond to bring them salt cakes several times a year. Raymond knew the rhythms of the Benedictines at St. Martial. He knew when their cheese was ready to cure, when the cellars needed meat for winter, and when they hosted visiting dignitaries who demanded finer fare. In those moments, salt was more than utility, it was reputation. And so Raymond sometimes saved his finest salt cakes for the monks, dense, smooth, pressed into neat rectangular blocks that traveled well. Not all salt was the same. Sea salt, rock salt, and salt from boiling brine all had distinct textures and purity levels. The monks knew the difference. In return, they gave him something rare: consistency. A warm place to sleep in the guest house. A bowl of thick soup and brown bread. A small leather token marking pardon from toll within a few leagues. These things were not just comforts, they were survival. Markets and the web of barter. Outside the abbey walls, Raymond stepped into a very different kind of system: the open market. The village square by mid-morning buzzed with slow energy. Chickens darted between stalls. A child trailed a stick through the mud. A potter shouted prices in 3 directions. Raymond sat on a flat stone and displayed his wares: 10 salt cakes in a linen-lined basket, some coarse and gray, others pale and smooth. He had learned to place the best ones at the front, a tactic as old as trade itself. But salt was not a flashy good. He wasn't a seller of silks or dyes. His trade relied on quiet regularity. He might sell 5 cakes by noon, one for eggs, another for dried lentils. A shepherd gave him a skin of sour wine in exchange for half a cake. A midwife, desperate to treat a wound, traded 2 bundles of lavender and a goatskin pouch. The rest he might store and carry to the next village. No coins changed hands, only goods. The value of salt was known, not fixed, but felt. It was measured in what it could replace, preserve, or restore. It was measured in hunger deferred. In the absence of banks, scales, or formal agreements, trust was everything. Raymond had traded with some of these people for over a decade. They remembered him. His beard had gone grayer, his mule slower, but he still brought good salt and he didn't cheat. In a world without receipts, that was enough. The role of memory and reputation. The medieval salt trade functioned as much on memory as material. There were no standardized brands, no national supply chains. Each trader was a business of one. Their names mattered. In some regions, traders marked their salt cakes with pressed symbols: a leaf, a cross, a ring to show origin or ownership. In others, they relied on faces, on stories, on repetition. Raymond was known as Le Muletier de la Mer, the mule man of the sea, even though he hadn't seen the coast in years. The name stuck, and with it, a kind of mythos. It gave his salt a whisper of distant waves. This reputation protected him. When a rival trader tried to undercut him one winter, the villagers bought only one cake and found it brittle and bitter. Raymond never had to say a word. The next season, they waited for him to return. This wasn't pride, it was strategy. He didn't just trade salt, he traded trust. He kept a list in his head. Which midwife had 2 children, which baker owed him a half cake's worth of bread, which farmer had a sick goat the year before and traded him onions out of desperation. He remembered who had short waits, who diluted their wine, who watered their milk. No one wrote these things down, but everyone remembered. The Salt Road, in that sense, was not a place. It was a relationship. Seasonality and the cadence of the year. Raymond's route followed the rhythm of the year, and the year followed salt. In spring, roads thawed and trade resumed. Salt delivered in April, preserved meats slaughtered before summer heat spoiled them. In summer, cheesemakers needed brining salt for new rounds of dairy. Autumn was a time of stocking barrels of fish, root vegetables, and salted pork for the winter ahead. And in winter, trade slowed, roads iced. Raymond would take shelter in monasteries or sleep in stables, venturing only short distances. Salt cakes kept well. They waited. His circuit was not random. It was a slow spiral, passing through 6 or 7 villages in a wide arc, timed to meet needs as they rose. He knew the road so well that he could name each bend by a tree or stone. La Branche Morte, La Roche Fendu, La Pente des Chevres. He didn't need a map. His world was written in landmarks and footprints. Once a scribe from the abbey asked him why he didn't draw a chart of his route. Raymond had shrugged. "There's no need," he said. "I just go where the salt is needed." That answer, simple as it sounds, was the heart of his profession. He wasn't chasing profit, he was responding to absence. When the salt didn't come, there were years when salt did arrive. Floods wiped out coastal salt pans. War disrupted trade routes. Monastic disputes closed roads. In those years, Raymond walked with less and sold only to those in direst need. He remembered one harsh winter when no salt reached the village of Bornet. That spring, the midwife told him 4 infants died from infections. The butcher couldn't cure meat. The local lord's table lacked fish for Lent. It was not dramatic, not war, not rebellion, just absence. Raymond said little, but when he returned the next season, he carried double. He gave 2 cakes freely to the midwife. And then he left. That was the salt trader's code, unspoken, to fill the gaps others could not see. Not because it was noble, but because it was necessary. As Raymond led his mule down a wooded slope the next morning, the sun broke through the trees in golden strands. He had 5 cakes left, enough for 2 more villages, maybe 3. He didn't know what stories he'd hear, what new needs would be voiced, what old debts would be repaid or forgotten. He only knew the road, and that somewhere ahead, someone needed salt. Raymond's final delivery of the season was made in a frost-covered village, just past the river Dowerby. The hamlet had no name on any royal charter, no church bell, no watchtower. Just a cluster of low stone houses with thatched roofs blackened by years of smoke. It was the kind of place traders passed if they didn't know it existed. But Raymond had walked these paths for more than 2 decades. He remembered it from a time when the salt cakes were heavier and his back less stiff. He reached the village on foot. The mule had thrown a shoe the day before, and Raymond had walked beside her to ease the load. He carried 2 salt cakes wrapped in dampened cloth, one for the baker who cured her own meats, and one for the tanner who used salt to fix hides in winter. They greeted him like an old friend. They always did. But this time, The baker met him with unexpected words. "There's a merchant now from Toulouse. He brings wagon loads of salt, cheaper, faster." Raymond smiled gently. "I imagine he does." He said nothing more. The change had been coming for years. The arrival of new systems. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the independent salt trader was increasingly overshadowed by more centralized systems of commerce. Guilds and monopolies. In many regions, salt was drawn under state or municipal control. Kings declared monopolies, especially in France, where the infamous Gabelle tax and regulation system on salt became a major source of royal revenue. Fixed supply chains. Towns began to rely on organized supply chains, using large merchants or official royal agents. These routes were better protected, carried greater quantities, and allowed for formal taxation and record keeping. Salt storage and granaries. Local storage facilities, salt barns, or communal granaries reduced dependence on itinerant traders. Communities could now store surplus salt for emergencies or seasonal shortages. Improved roads and wagons. Technological improvements allowed for wagons to carry bulk salt over longer distances, replacing the slow, labor-intensive circuits of mule traders. In this new world, men like Raymond were seen as relics, slow, quaint, personal, but inefficient. And so the salt roads, once vibrant with the echo of boots and hooves, began to fade. The trader's quiet exit. Raymond didn't fight the change. He wasn't a revolutionary nor a merchant prince. He was a man who walked with salt. That winter he made his usual circuit, but fewer doors opened to him. Some villages had newer, younger traders. Some had direct contracts with abbeys. Some had simply changed their needs. He gave away his remaining cakes to the sisters at a roadside hospice and returned to a cousin's farm outside Uzes. He left his ledger unwritten that year. The mule, old and slowing, was turned to pasture. Raymond took to gathering wood, helping mend fences, and visiting his old clients as a guest rather than a merchant. He no longer traded, but he still walked. He carried stories now instead of salt. When asked about the road, he'd nod and say, "It remembers me and I remember it." Salt without the trader. The salt still came. It came in barrels and wagons, shipped by river or sold in large lots by licensed vendors. In France, the Gabelle taxed salt heavily, making it a symbol of royal overreach and a target of resentment. By the 18th century, salt smuggling, faux sauniers, became so widespread that entire underground economies grew around it. But the salt itself, the cakes, the weight, the sharp taste on the tongue, it remained. What vanished was the figure who once carried it through forests and across valleys. The personal bond between source and need was replaced by coin and contract. And with that change, the stories faded too. No one asked anymore where the salt came from. No one traded it for onions or wool. No one watched for the mule man's silhouette on the ridge at dusk. The road had changed, but not entirely. The endurance of footpaths. Even centuries later, many of the old salt routes survive in unexpected ways. Some became walking trails. Others became rural lanes. A few were absorbed into larger trade roads. In southern France, parts of the Via Salaria were paved over by Roman engineers, then later followed by medieval pilgrims and merchants. Villages still rest at regular intervals along these paths, the spacing determined not by maps, but by how far a man and a mule could travel in a day. Stone milestones, worn and unreadable, sit forgotten by roadside hedges. Low, flat stones where loads were once rested still dot some trails. In a few chapels, faded frescoes show traders offering salt as tithe. They are quiet reminders of a time when every handful of salt came at a cost not in gold, but in footsteps. Reflection, a thread in the tapestry. The story of the salt trader is not one of triumph or collapse. It is a story of continuity and quiet replacement. It reminds us that history is not only the rise and fall of empires, but the slow erosion of need, the subtle shifting of paths. That the systems we take for granted today, logistics, taxation, markets, were once deeply personal acts of movement, memory, and barter. Raymond never led a rebellion. He didn't change the world. But he fed it, one salt cake at a time. Final thought. As you sit with this tale, think not of salt as seasoning but as survival. And think not of the road as a line between two places, but as the space where human trust, effort, and endurance once carried the weight of the world silently, and often alone. Story 6. Bureaucrats Beneath the Dome. Daily Life in the Abbasid Chancery. You are standing in the heart of Baghdad. The year is 826 CE. The Tigris flows broad and steady to the east. The air smells faintly of parchment, damp linen, and cooked chickpeas. To your right, a courier hurries past on foot, his sandals slapping against the packed earth street. He carries a scroll wrapped tightly in dyed silk, tied with a red cord, the signature of urgency. Behind him, past courtyards shaded with palm, sits a building not meant to impress but to organize. This is the Diwan al-Insha, the Abbasid Chancery, the bureaucratic nerve center of one of the largest and most sophisticated empires the world had yet known. Inside, a dozen scribes sit hunched over writing boards, their styluses dancing across papyrus and parchment, copying, revising, verifying. They will never be mentioned in the grand histories, but their words will shape taxes, appointments, trade routes, military campaigns, and the very image of the caliph himself. This is the story of the silent architects of empire, the bureaucrats beneath the dome. The Abbasid administration, order from ink. The Abbasid Caliphate, which reigned from 750 to 1258 CE, was vast, stretching from North Africa to the Indus Valley. Its diversity in language, religion, geography, and culture required an administrative system of staggering complexity. At its center was a bureaucracy that took lessons from the Persian Sassanids, refined them with Islamic values, and added layers of accountability and literary excellence. The Chancery was the engine of that system. Known as the Diwan al-Insha, it was responsible for drafting official correspondence, recording laws and decrees, issuing appointments and titles, monitoring governors and provincial officials, preserving archives, managing diplomatic correspondence. Its head, the Katib al-Insha, chief secretary, reported directly to the caliph or his vizier, but beneath him were dozens, sometimes hundreds of clerks, scribes, and record keepers. They were the quiet pulse behind the glittering court. A day in the life of a chancery clerk. Imagine yourself as Yusuf ibn Khalid, a middle-ranking scribe in the chancery. You arrive just after the dawn prayer, wearing a clean cotton robe, a simple belt, and carrying your tools. Reed pens, kalam, a small knife for trimming the nibs, a smooth inkwell, and a leather roll of pre-treated parchment sheets. Your place is at a narrow wooden desk near a shaded colonnade. The building is cool in the morning, but by midday the sun will beat down hard on the clay tiles. Your supervisor gives you the day's assignments: 5 responses to provincial governors, a draft of an edict for the Friday sermon, and 2 copies of a treaty for signature. Each task must be done in elegant Naskh or Kufi script, legible, aesthetic, and free of error. One smudge, one miswritten name, one improper seal, and your work is discarded. The hours pass in silence, broken only by the scratching of pens, the occasional cough, or the quiet conversation of clerks confirming a governor's title or debating how to phrase an instruction without appearing harsh. Language is power here. A well-crafted sentence can persuade. A misplaced word can insult. Your training in adab, the literary culture of the court, is as important as your calligraphy. You are not writing for today alone. These documents will be copied, preserved, read aloud in mosques, and sometimes sent to foreign courts. They must endure. The culture of caution and precision. There is a reason why chancery scribes are trained for years before ever composing an original letter. The Abbasid court expects perfection not just in grammar or spelling, but in tone, structure, and decorum. There are unwritten rules. Never refer to the caliph directly without appropriate praise. Always balance authority with diplomacy in provincial correspondence. Use formulaic openings and closings rooted in Islamic tradition. Avoid metaphor unless approved. Even the layout matters. Lines must be straight, margins even. Seals must be placed correctly and never upside down. Errors are not merely embarrassing. They can have real consequences. A miswritten location might send troops to the wrong city. An omitted clause could void a tax exemption. A wrongly attributed title could insult a tribal leader and trigger rebellion. So you read, then reread. Then ask your colleague to reread it again. And only then do you submit it for review. The archive, memory of the empire. Once approved and sealed, a copy of the correspondence is sent to the recipient, often by foot courier, horseback, or along river trade routes. But another copy is kept. This is the function of the Beit al-Diwan, the archive room. Here, scribes and clerks maintain thousands of scrolls, documents, and wax-sealed records. They are organized by region, by category, by year. Some scrolls are decades old. Others, more fragile, are copies of even older documents from Umayyad or Sassanid times. The archive is a place of quiet reverence. You visit it rarely, but when you do, it is to consult precedent. How was a similar case handled 10 years ago? What phrase was used in that famous treaty with the Byzantines? What kind of seal was attached to royal appointments in Khurasan? Every document holds a fragment of the caliphate's administrative memory. And you, a mere clerk, are one of its caretakers. Chancery politics, power behind the pen. Though scribes are seldom seen at court banquets or military parades, they wield immense influence. A clever phrase inserted into a decree can shift power. A delay in issuing a title can sabotage a governor's ambitions. A leak to the wrong faction can change policy. That is why powerful families often try to place their sons in the chancery, even in low positions. From there, they build connections, gather information, and learn the subtle games of bureaucracy. The caliph's vizier, often the most powerful man in the empire after the caliph himself, typically rose from the chancery ranks. And within the chancery, status matters. A junior clerk might copy dictated letters. A mid-ranking scribe like Yusuf drafts and reviews. A senior scribe composes edicts from scratch and meets with ministers. At the top sits the Katib al-Insha, who oversees it all, balancing politics, language, and diplomacy in every line. And yet, despite this quiet power, few outside the system know their names. The invisible, yet indispensable. By mid-afternoon, your inkwell has dried slightly. You refill it. Your fingers are stained black. You've revised one letter 3 times because the vizier wanted a softer tone. You hear news that a messenger has arrived from Samarkand. He carries a scroll the length of your forearm, wrapped in embroidered silk. It contains complaints from a regional governor about tax collection and troop rotation. You will spend tomorrow drafting the response. As the sun sets, you carefully clean your reed pen, roll your finished scrolls in leather, and hand them to the courier master for dispatch. You leave the chancery just as the night lamps are being lit. The city bustles around you, traders haggling, children playing, the call to prayer echoing down alleyways. No one notices you. No one knows what you carried out in your satchel. But the fate of provinces, the shape of laws, and the image of the caliph in the farthest corners of the empire all pass through your fingers. Unresolved thought. If a single misplaced word in a chancery letter could alter the trajectory of an empire, what happened when politics not error dictated the pen? The morning arrives with an unusual chill. Yusuf ibn Khalid, our mid-level chancery scribe, is already awake, packing the narrow courtyard between his quarters and the chancery. The faint clatter of palm fronds sways above him, and below, a slow tension creeps across the brick walkway. He feels it, not just in the air, but in the subtle rearrangement of desks, the quickened pace of the couriers, and the guarded tone of the clerks reviewing correspondence. Something is happening. And while swords clash in distant campaigns and envoys argue over trade routes in court, here in the Diwan al-Insha, the front line is paper, the weapon is the pen, and the war is waged in carefully worded directives, sealed with wax and dispatched in silence. When the pen serves the court and its rivalries. Baghdad in the 9th century was not merely the capital of an empire, it was a stage for intricate rivalries. Rival factions within the Abbasid court vied for control of provinces, revenues, and religious authority. The caliph, though revered, often found himself a symbolic figurehead, manipulated by powerful viziers and military elites. The Diwan al-Insha, while officially neutral, became a crucial space where these tensions surfaced not through open defiance, but through subtle phraseology, deliberate delays, and the ghost of omission. As a chancery scribe, Yusuf often received requests that were less about administration and more about maneuvering. A powerful provincial governor might send an urgent appeal to the caliph, bypassing the vizier. The chancery, tasked with drafting the response, had choices. Should the reply acknowledge the urgency? Should it address the governor by his full title or omit honorifics? Should it include praise for his governance or remain dry and neutral? Each choice, each adjective, each salutation carried meaning. Yusuf's hand hovered over the parchment like a diplomat over a treaty. Ghostwriters of power. It was understood, if never spoken aloud, that senior scribes often acted as ghostwriters for the vizier. A directive issued in the caliph's name might, in fact, be drafted by a clerk loyal to the vizier or influenced by a powerful family with ties to the chancery. The caliph might sign or seal it, but the thoughts were not his. Sometimes, two drafts were prepared for the same decree, one for the official record, the other with slightly modified language for actual delivery. One version pleased the vizier, the other appeased the military commander. Yusuf once saw a junior clerk quietly erase a line from a draft because it offended the vizier's brother. No one objected. The line was forgotten. This was not corruption, exactly. It was the invisible art of maintaining balance. Bureaucracy wasn't just about order. It was about managing contradiction, reconciling ambition with protocol, pride with hierarchy. And the chancery, with its endless scrolls and seal stamps, was where this delicate choreography unfolded. Scandals and scapegoats. Not all scribes navigated this balance well. There were moments when politics reached deep into the chancery and pulled a clerk into the spotlight, usually for the worse. Take the case of Letter 2BF, Abd al-Rahman al-Tamimi, a scribe accused of altering a decree that redirected tax revenue from a southern province to a rival faction in Samarra. He swore he was following orders. The decree bore the vizier's seal. But someone needed to take the blame. Al-Tamimi was dismissed, imprisoned briefly, and then quietly exiled to Wasit, where he died unknown. No one mentioned him again. Yusuf remembered him well. They had once shared a writing desk. Al-Tamimi's calligraphy had been exquisite. Now his name was erased not just from the chancery rolls, but from memory. The lesson was clear. Scribes were powerful but expendable. The power of delay. Sometimes, the most effective tool a chancery clerk had was not the pen, but the drawer. A letter could be written, but not sent. A draft could be approved, but misplaced. A request could be acknowledged, but never fulfilled. Delay in a bureaucracy that claimed to value timeliness was a silent form of power. Yusuf had once delayed sending a decree authorizing troop movements to a restless province. He did not disapprove of the content. He simply recognized that the timing was poor harvest season, high tensions, a regional flood. He waited 3 days. The flood receded, tempers cooled, the decree was sent. The army never needed to march. That act, small, silent, undocumented, may have prevented bloodshed. No one praised him. But sometimes, preserving the peace meant bending the process, training the next generation. Yusuf had recently been tasked with mentoring a younger scribe, Faris, bright, ambitious, but impatient. Faris wanted to write decrees on his own, to skip the copying stage, to leave his mark. Yusuf gave him a single task: copy the same letter A dismissal of a tax officer 10 times, using 10 different tones. One with gentle regret, one with scathing reproach, one with neutral civility, one with praise followed by punishment. Faris was puzzled. Which one will be used? Yusuf smiled. Whichever the vizier needs. That was the lesson. A good scribe doesn't write what he feels. He writes what is needed by the moment, by the politics, by the empire. He writes knowing his words might be signed by someone else, delivered by someone else, and judged by someone else. And yet he writes, because the state cannot speak for itself. It needs a voice. Diplomacy by scroll. Beyond domestic politics, the chancery was also the voice of the Abbasid Caliphate to the outside world. Letters were sent to the Byzantine emperor, with carefully chosen religious invocations; the Tang court in China, in Persian and Arabic translations; the rulers of Al-Andalus, to negotiate scholarly exchanges; Indian princes, discussing trade and safe passage for merchants. These letters were often ornate both in content and form. They might be perfumed, wrapped in brocade, adorned with golden thread. They were as much about symbolism as substance. In these moments, Yusuf's pen became the voice of a civilization. He knew the Byzantines would read the letter aloud to their court, analyzing each phrase for insult or submission. So every word had to walk a line firm but respectful, authoritative but dignified. It was a strange kind of diplomacy, one in which the handshake was replaced by handwriting. And no mistake could be made. Uncertainty in ink. As Yusuf closed his writing kit that day, he looked down at his hands. They were ink-stained, calloused, precise. They had held no sword, they had won no battles, they had built no mosques. But they had shaped the empire invisibly, daily, faithfully. Yet he knew his work would not be remembered. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was successful. Good bureaucracy leaves no trace. It simply works. Unresolved question. What happens when a state built on order, and ink begins to lose faith in its own words, when scribes write for rulers who no longer read, and seals no longer carry weight? The river Tigris still flowed, but slower now, or so it seemed. The bustling wharves of Baghdad had quieted in recent years. The caravans were fewer, the foreign embassies less frequent, and inside the once orderly chambers of the Diwan al-Insha, a quiet unease crept in like dust through the lattice windows. Yusuf ibn Khalid, once steady of hand and firm in protocol, now found himself hesitating more often, not because of age, though his beard had long since gone gray, but because the structure that gave his life meaning was no longer certain. The chancery was changing, and the empire it served unraveling. The bureaucracy at its peak. To appreciate its decline, one must first understand its height. In the golden centuries of the Abbasid Caliphate, especially between the late 8th and mid-9th centuries. The bureaucracy operated as a masterpiece of organization. The chancery's authority stretched across province and district appointments. No governor took office without a sealed letter of designation from the Diwan al-Insha. Military coordination, troop movements, rationing, and regional reinforcements all required written approval. Even emergency actions were later documented and reviewed. Taxation and exemptions. Policies were debated by viziers, codified by the chancery, and stored for future precedent. Scholarly patronage. Grants and stipends to scholars, translators, and architects were issued from the pen of chancery scribes. Every piece of this administrative apparatus relied on the trust that a sealed document reflected the will of the caliph, or, increasingly, the vizier. But even bureaucracies built on paper and process are not immune to the tremors of politics, war, and human ambition. The cracks begin to show. By the mid-9th century, several developments began to strain the system. The rise of the military class. The Ghilman Turkish slave soldiers trained as elite troops began to assert real power in the court. Caliphs became dependent on them for protection. Some scribes began receiving orders directly from military officers rather than the vizier or caliph. Fragmentation of authority. Regional governors, once compliant and letter-bound, began to rule independently. In Egypt, North Africa, and Persia, dynasties emerged that paid lip service to Baghdad while ignoring its decrees. Letters from the chancery went unanswered. Seal-bearers were turned away. Economic instability. As trade routes shifted and tax revenues fell, the chancery found itself issuing more decrees to suppress unrest or renegotiate contracts. This flooded the system and diluted its authority. Political instability in court. Caliphs were overthrown, viziers assassinated, and rival factions bribed scribes. For the first time, Yusuf witnessed forged documents poorly done, but dangerous nonetheless. The chain of trust was fraying. The chancery still functioned, the pen still moved, but something vital had changed. Its words no longer held unquestioned authority. The collapse of a seal. It was a minor scandal, really. A provincial commander in Khorasan executed a local tax official based on a forged decree. The document bore the caliph's name, the chancery's seal, and all the correct phrasing. Only upon investigation did Yusuf discover that the seal had been copied a lump of wax, imprinted with a replica borrowed briefly from a junior courier during a festival. The caliph was furious, the vizier humiliated. But no one was punished, because everyone, even the guilty, knew the truth. If a forgery worked, it was because the chancery's prestige had already eroded. The power of the pen depended on belief. And belief, once cracked, is not easily repaired. Memory in a dusty archive. Yusuf now spent more time in the archive room. He walked the rows of scrolls and ledgers like a monk in a library. The ink had faded on many documents. Some seals had crumbled, but others endured firm, clear, dignified. He found letters from his youth, decrees he had penned on behalf of the caliph to distant governors who are now long dead or ruling their own kingdoms. One scroll caught his eye. It was a letter to the emperor of the Tang dynasty in China, elegant, formal, and respectful. He had copied it twice in both Arabic and Persian. He remembered the weight of the silk wrapping, the diplomatic escort, the care with which it was folded. He smiled. That letter, sent across deserts and mountains, may have shaped trade policy for decades. And yet, no one in the chancery remembered it now. The vanishing of the scribe. One by one, the old scribes retired or were removed. Younger men arrived. Their calligraphy was competent but hurried. Their knowledge of adab, the literary tradition, was thin. They spoke of administration in terms of efficiency, not elegance. More dangerously, some were appointed for political reasons, not merit. Sons of allies, cousins of viziers, friends of generals. They followed instructions, rarely questioned protocol, and signed documents with minimal reflection. Yusuf tried to teach them. He spoke of balance, of subtlety, of historical precedent. He warned of the power in phrasing and the danger in rigidity. But they were impatient. One even laughed. Master Yusuf, the world is no longer moved by scrolls. It is moved by soldiers and silver. Yusuf said nothing. But that night, he returned to his chamber and stared at his inkwell for a long time. It was nearly empty. He did not refill it. Echoes of what once was. Eventually, Yusuf left the chancery. He was not dismissed, no one would dare insult his decades of service, but he was gently encouraged to rest and make space for younger minds. He returned to a modest home near the Zubaydiya Canal, where he copied poems from memory and composed short histories of the chancery. Not grand narratives, just descriptions of how things were done, how scrolls were folded, how seals were stored. He wrote not for the caliph, nor for the state, but for anyone who might one day wonder what it meant to serve ink. He did not know if anyone would read them, but he believed it mattered. Because even as the chancery's voice grew faint, the written word still had its own quiet defiance. The final function of the scribe. It is tempting to say the Abbasid chancery died with the decline of the caliphate, but that is not entirely true. Its forms, its traditions, its techniques, they endured. They were absorbed by later dynasties, the Buyids, the Seljuks, the Mamluks. Even the Ottomans built their vast bureaucracy on models first refined in Baghdad. The structure changed, but the idea that the state needs scribes, that ink shapes history, that memory must be preserved lived on. In that sense, Yusuf was not the end of something. He was a thread in a long and fragile tapestry frayed, but never fully severed. Final reflection. We remember caliphs, conquests, and calamities, but beneath every decree, every border, every treaty, there was a scribe unseen, anonymous, who gave the empire its voice. In a world now governed by code and screens, perhaps we, too, are still chasing the precision of ink and the quiet power of those who dare to write what others only think.